Professor Timothy Garton Ash, in your book, The File, you speak about your experience in the old RDA in East Berlin when you were under surveillance of the Stasi. In what ways did this experience inspire your commitment, your actual present commitment with free speech?
Absolutely decisive, because I was living in what Orwell described in 1984, a totalitarian police state. And after German unification, I discovered that the Stasi, the East German secret police, had compiled a large file on me describing minute by minute what I was doing. And I understood there that for a dictatorship, controlling speech, expression is absolutely crucial. And in fact, free speech is the freedom on which all other freedoms depend.
How could you get in touch with those files after the
Because you have in Argentina a long time ago the experience of what you do after a dictatorship.
Yeah.
You had a truth commission,
yeah.
And East Germany did something similar, but they actually systematically opened all the secret police files, and being orderly Germans, they'd kept the files.
You were already a student, a postgraduate student at that time?
I was a postgraduate student from Oxford,
yeah.
And I initially went to write about the Nazi dictatorship,
wow.
And ended up writing a book about the communist dictatorship in East Germany.
We're very interested in your latest book on free speech.
Yeah.
There you compare Marshall McLuhan's metaphor of a global village with our present cosmopolis. You say that idea, that notion of a global village,
yeah.
is not a desirable metaphor,
yeah.
Not useful for our
yeah.
present times. Can you explain why it is no more useful?
So he talked about the global village. A village is a small place where most people have lived there all their lives. What it's like today is living in one big city, which I call cosmopolis, because anyone who has a smartphone can communicate directly with half of humankind, more than 3 billion people. And we've never lived in a world like that before. And the challenge it poses is, how do we live together when we're all like people living in a big city, in one big city? The world is becoming one big city.
You also say that this idea of a global village should not be what we want to recover.
No, because villages are
yeah.
small, quite homogeneous, and often rather intolerant places.
Okay.
We don't want everywhere to be a village, whereas a big city like Buenos Aires,
yeah.
You have an incredible richness and diversity of life. And the larger point is that, can we make the internet still a huge liberating instrument where we become more free, encounter more different people,
yeah.
or is it actually going to become a new kind of Orwellian Big Brother? Because if you look at what's happening in China, it's becoming an instrument for mass surveillance. And the truth is, what Facebook and Google and Twitter together know about you or me is beyond the Stasi's wildest dreams.
I was wondering if maybe the idea of a village is quite a reductive place, a very domestic place. Really, it doesn't fit our ideal of urban, cosmopolitan communication.
Right.
But I was thinking about the contraposition we find between a cosmopolis. Cosmopolis historically is a notion that begins after Alexander the Great and his conquest, his imperial conquest of the great quantity of polis, of cities, and the Aristotelian polis, which is a place whose reason of being is properly free speech,
right.
A place where we can
right.
discuss on what is good, what is bad, what is just,
right.
what is unjust. Maybe we could try not to go back to a village, but to a polis?
It's a very good question because, of course, one of the classic arguments for free speech, going all the way back to ancient Greece, is we need free speech for democracy in order to govern ourselves well. And we now do that basically at the level of the nation state. And so we have newspapers, we have television, we have radio, we have a great debate, we have an election, we choose our government. But in the meantime, if actually we're all becoming neighbors with everyone else, can we do that on a global scale? So my book is a very ambitious attempt to try and work out what might be some sort of basic principles on which we could actually all agree for living together in a world where we're all becoming neighbors. Because otherwise we're going to start fighting each other. So it's not going to be that there's one world government and the whole world is like a state, but there's something which is a cosmopolitan polis above the nation state, which remains the basic unit.
Going back to the historical point of view, you used to speak of several events, historical events, that quicken this transformation from a village, or so-called village, to a cosmopolis during 20th century. Can you identify those events?
We have lived through, in the last 40 years, the biggest revolution in communications since the 15th century, since the invention of printing and Johannes Gutenberg. I talk about the post-Gutenberg world. I'm a Gutenberg man. I grew up essentially with the world of print. But this very morning, sitting in my hotel, I was reading newspapers from all over the world on my phone, in my pocket here. That's an amazing transformation. And if you add to that the revolution in travel, I mean notably the jet airplane, which means that people are moving about physically. And so the big free speech controversies of our time, like think about Charlie Hebdo, the affair around Charlie Hebdo, or the Mohammed cartoons, are about the intersection of the physical and the virtual neighborhood, the local and the global. So if we had just virtual neighborhood, just a smartphone, but everybody lived in their own little villages, it wouldn't be the same sort of problem. Or if we had everybody living together but we didn't have the smartphone, it wouldn't be. But the combination of the two means that it's explosive. Someone publishes a cartoon in Southern California or posts a video on YouTube, I tell the story of that, and people die in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Someone issues a death threat in Pakistan and someone dies in Paris.
In your own side, I mean, free speech, you discuss precisely on Charlie Hebdo and other cases of collision of this information technology revolution and the problem of arguing and fighting with the other. In what sense do you think we could enhance, accept, or promote an unqualified free speech?
This is actually a cana, it's a red herring. So people say, but you know, we can't live in a world which has unlimited free speech. No serious person has ever said we should. The whole debate about free speech is the debate about what the limits should be and who should impose those limits and how. And my argument is that the state, with its legitimate monopoly of violence, the police, the law courts, should be focused on real harms. So if someone is credibly threatening to kill you, I want everything to be done to prevent that, all the power of the state to come down. But when it comes to stuff which is merely hateful or offensive, and the internet is full of that, I don't want the state getting involved, but I want us as citizens, as human beings, to work it out for ourselves. So I want actually less to be done, but better to be done by law, but more to be done by us in civil society. And that's actually what the ancient Greeks wanted. They wanted people to work it out for themselves, because that's how we become mature, free, enlightened human beings. It's by interacting with other people, hearing different points of view, hearing things we find offensive, and working out how to live with them.
You distinguish very clearly between dangerous speech or dangerous speech and hate speech.
Exactly. So this is a crucial distinction in the book, which is insufficiently made, because now we have a whole slew of governments across Europe which are trying to criminalize hate speech altogether. And by the way, Facebook is also trying to close down hate speech. That's an incredibly broad category of speech. My argument is that we should go after dangerous speech, the speech which is actually going to result in serious physical or psychological harm.
You speak of three criteria. I mean, it must be, if I'm not mistaken, it must be credible, intended, likely, and imminent.
Likely, that was so that's a classic North American test.
Yeah.
That if I say Justina should be killed, that in itself is not enough. Is it the violence intended, likely, and imminent? The difficulty we have with the internet is what is imminent on the internet, where everything is immanent.
Yeah.
Something said in Pakistan 10 years ago can be as immediate in its effect as something said just 5 seconds ago in the same room.
So the idea of the book is also to provide legal, philosophical, but
well, the idea of the book is to lay out principles which are the result of a transcultural conversation. So that's also very important, not just within the West, but with India, with China, with the Islamic world. And only then do you answer. So for example, on violence, my principle is we neither make threats of violence nor accept violent intimidation. So both sides are important. Then you have to ask the question, who's going to make that a reality? And in that, Facebook and Google and Twitter may be more important than your government.
But they are private companies.
So this is a whole new challenge. We've had newspapers, we've had television, broadcasters. We've never had a world in which one private company is setting the terms of speech for more than 2 billion people every day.
Yeah. Also, Stasi, at what point was controlled? I mean, was over and you could see the files, but Facebook or, those private companies.
So as I mentioned to you a moment ago, I just flew here yesterday from Silicon Valley, where I've been spending the summer. And I spent a lot of time talking specifically to Facebook about that, because if you think about what the state says you can't say by law, it's transparent, it's accountable, and it's appealable. Right? That's the theory anyway. The practice may be a bit different, depends on your country. What Facebook decides is non-transparent, non-accountable, and non-appealable. And so I'm pushing them to make it more transparent, more appealable. So actually they've just introduced an appeals system. So if you say something about, I don't know, somebody in Brazil and it's taken down, you can appeal against the takedown, and ultimately more accountable.
In your own experience talking to people from those companies, in what way do they receive these points?
It's complicated because they obviously still want to make a lot of money. And that's what they are. They're a profit-making company. And the way they make profit is about getting people to spend as many hours as possible, going to as many different pages as possible, and then they can sell you and me and all the other users to the advertisers. And we know from research that has been done that that means that fake news, disinformation, is even more likely to go viral than accurate information. So actually it's a big deal for them if they're going to say, we have a public responsibility, like, say, a public service broadcaster, and we're actually going to change the algorithms so that we privilege more authentic, more trustworthy content. But they're under a lot of pressure to do that. A lot of pressure from governments and a lot of pressure from public opinion. So they're beginning to move, actually. The alternative is that governments step in and regulate. Germany has already done, France and Britain are talking about it. But that's not a good solution.
Why not?
Because it sacrifices the liberating potential of the internet. At its very simplest, someone who lived in Burma under the dictators or under China can emigrate at the click of a button on their smartphone and be in a virtual America or virtual Germany or virtual Argentina and enjoy the freedom of speech that people enjoy here. And that's an amazing gift to people who live in a dictatorship. And if we accept the model that government can decide what can be said or not said online in its territory, then we've lost that great advantage. And it's no accident that Vladimir Putin's Russia immediately copied the German law on content. They've immediately copied it, because that's just what Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or Recep Tayyip Erdogan want. It's just what Hugo Chavez would have wanted, is, right, the government decides what can be said and what can't, what's true and what's false.
Probably the difference is that in Germany you have lots of newspapers. I mean, you have a
very
big,
responsible, limited government, and I have every confidence that they're trying to use it responsibly. But the precedent you set is a very dangerous one. And so I would rather go down the route of self-regulation and try and persuade Facebook to do it itself.
Maybe in a country where you have a big public sphere, is less harmful to have those.
But remember that the German law applies to all online speech.
When we speak of the challenges and the threats that new technologies of information put to every person, not only intellectuals and the people who can get in touch with the responsible, people may find they have nothing to do.
You mean intellectuals?
No, probably the people who are not intellectuals.
Right.
They can find, and what can I do? I can do nothing, I'm just a victim.
So the metaphor I use is that we have the big dogs, the big cats, and the mice. The big dogs are the governments, the big cats are Facebook, Google, Twitter, Amazon, and we are the mice. And we feel powerless, what can we little mice do? But actually, networked mice have considerable power. So the one thing we know is that we can connect with other people online very quickly. And once you've networked, you're quite a big mouse, if I can put it that way. And these companies are actually, since they make all their money out of us, they're not particularly frightened of the US government, but they're really frightened of losing their users. So we actually have, now of course, let me just say quickly, that assumes that there's somewhere else we can go. So there's a real problem of monopoly here, of these being close to monopoly. So one thing I do want the state to do is to ensure there's competition. And that's something the European Union is doing at the moment. It's trying to push that there should be real competition.
Before in the conversation you said that it is important to include everybody in our notion of free speech, not just Western countries. In fact, our papers, digital papers, online papers, are usually made by Western, white, middle class people. So how can we have free speech without including the perspective of the other one as a reasonable speaker?
So I think that's a really good question. Who holds the loudspeaker? Who holds the microphone, as it were? And of course, these are power relations. But you know, compared with a world 100 years ago, when the American writer A.J. Liebling said, freedom of the press is enjoyed only by those who own one.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's nothing new, but there was one newspaper for a city, right? Or mostly two. At least in principle, the internet gives an opportunity for many more voices to be heard. And actually you can see that, for example, you take the Sinti and Roma, the gypsy population, you know, how can their voice be heard? They're not reported in the mainstream media, but they have their audience. But do those voices really get heard? Do they reach a mass audience? That's the question. So the challenge is not to close down the dominant voices, but to build up the voices of the weak and the minorities and the global south and so on, right? And at best, free speech has always been a weapon for the powerless against the powerful, not the other way around.
You put a big emphasis on, and I think it deserves, on the role of religion or religious beliefs in free speech. In what way do you think, personally, that religious beliefs and religions in general, big religions or small religions or minority religions, can help to improve free speech?
Improve?
Can they help? Could they help to improve free speech?
There's a huge difference between particular religions. And there, for example, there was a comic opera done about the Church of Scientology. And instead of getting completely outraged and offended and having massive demonstrations, the Church of Scientology took out advertisements in the theater to say, you've seen the opera, now come and see the real thing. So that was a great way to respond.
Yeah.
You couldn't imagine a comic opera about the Prophet Muhammad without a slightly different response. So there are great differences between religions. Yeah. But I like your question, which is, how could they help? So what a lot of religions have in common, and this is something I learned from the Indian tradition in particular. India, of course, has incredible religious diversity, is the emphasis on the listener rather than the speaker. So if you go back to the edicts of the Emperor Ashoka, way back, 2,000 years ago, more, what he's talking about is how do we become good listeners and have the ability to listen with imaginative sympathy to very different points of view and other people's religions. And I think that's something we could potentially learn, how to be a good listener.
Many people think religion is against free speech in general, also our Western religions. But I remember the first act of the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, was set by a Sweden pastor, a religious person.
That's true, and of course in the United States, the religious pluralism, the diversity, the free market of religions, a pretty extraordinary free market of religions too, is very closely connected to the idea of free speech. So that there's a distinction to be made with freedom for religion and freedom from religion. Yeah. So some West Europeans now confuse these two things, and they think that secularism is actually atheism, it's freedom from religion. In my view, liberal secularism has to be freedom for all religions and none, not freedom from religion.
Okay. I thank you very much for your patience and your clear exposition.
It's a real pleasure.